Good morning to you all. For those who are visiting, my name is Daniel Thomas. I'm one of the pastors here, and we have joined together, as is our custom at Katoomba Baptist Church, to partake and commemorate and celebrate Reformation Sunday. We have been doing this for many, many years now in honour of the Reformation, the date that is universally identified as the beginning back in October 31st, 1517, when the then theologian and professor and Augustinian friar Martin Luther posted his 95 theses, his 95 disputations, arguments, etc., upon the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. We have been in the middle, or rather now in the tail end, of a 20-week topical series on the attributes of God, and so we're taking a break from that for 1 week before we finish off the last 3 weeks in November, which lead us right into Advent. But herein we sing songs that are in the relative time frame of the early centuries of the Reformation. We also read, and as we have read, a number of seminal texts that were of vital importance to the rediscovery and the proclamation and the enlightenment of the doctrine of the gospel itself. Many of them from 2 Timothy, and the importance and vitality of the fact that all scripture is breathed out by God. It is theopneustos. It is God-breathed. It is inspired. We have read other passages that pertain, of course, most importantly in Romans chapter 1, verse 17, about the just or the righteous living by faith, right? And the vital importance that we've explained many times before of how Martin Luther read that and saw that it is indeed not by the constant slavish works that had developed in the sacerdotal system of the Roman Church some 500 to 1,000 years ago, but rather the justification comes by faith. Herein we are going to take a much broader view. We've done a variety of different sermons over the years, of course, pertaining specifically and particularly to the heart of the Reformation. But this morning we will be examining the passage that we have just had read to us from Matthew chapter 16, which is and was indeed 500 years ago a very important text. It is still a vitally important text in some of the areas of theology that we refer to as ecclesiology, right, or the function and the theology, the formation of the church proper. And we will be exploring the exegetical theology of the verses contained therein, and particularly what it means for Christ to build his church. What is the rock? What does it mean that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and so on and so forth. We'll also address some of the many applications that can be drawn from this particular passage. There is no shortage of application that can indeed be drawn, but we will be particularly focusing upon the way in which Christ's words here and his declaration, not just to Peter, but to the apostles or the disciples, then disciples standing before him, speaks to the very heart of God's mission in the world. So let's pick up in verse 13, which gives us some of the beginning context of A, where on earth we are, literally, and B, how we are to then frame and understand the context of this particular passage. So you'll see in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, that we are up in a place called Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, and it says in verse 13, now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples a question. Now, first and foremost, which is understandable, simply reading that we are in Caesarea Philippi might as well be in the middle of Mongolia. What on earth that means, where on earth it was, why on earth it is significant, because it is very much significant to this passage, is something which may not be illuminated to you. So if you indulge me in our first piece of history this morning, let's explain exactly where we are in Caesarea Philippi and why it's significant that this occurred here. So, Caesarea Philippi. For anyone who knows even the remote amount of Hebrew, they can realise that it is not a Hebrew name. It is in fact a Greek name, a Hellenic name as we would say. And Caesarea Philippi is up in the far northern extents of what you would ever call Judea, or the province of Judea at the time in the Roman Empire. It's about, let's just say 40-ish kilometres north of the Sea of Galilee, or if you're trying to reference it from Jerusalem, it's over 200 kilometres north of Jerusalem, about 230. So roughly thinking the equivalent of about here in Katoomba up to Newcastle. right? Up in the Hunter region. It's about that far away. So we're up north here. And Caesarea Philippi was a city that was founded after Alexander the Great conquered that area of Judea and the broader area of the land of Canaan. It is named Caesarea Philippi for a variety of reasons. First, because it was called just simply Caesarea. By the time we get to the days of Augustus, the founding emperor of the Roman Empire, right, just in the years before the birth of Christ himself, it was named in honour of the Caesar, right? Hence Caesarea. Afterwards, by the time Jesus is a child, it is then transferred to the governor of that particular area, that particular province, as we're told, the district, named Philip II, or Herod Philip II, the son of Herod the Great, the Hasmonean ruler of Judea. And so hence it becomes Caesarea Philippi and becomes the capital of his district. It's an important city and was very much an important city in its own standing, but particularly for its religious context. See, originally, when Alexander the Great conquered and established the city, at least in its foundations, the Greek god Pan, the god of many things, but particularly rural wilderness, farming, agriculture, fertility, so on and so forth, was worshipped there. Over time, as more Hellenistic peoples or Greek peoples moved there, various other Greek deities were also worshipped, Zeus, Tyche, Nemesis, so on, until we eventually get down to the time where we are here, wherein the imperial cult of Caesar, right, the divine worship cult of the Caesar, of the emperor himself, was now the foremost religious cult in the city. Foremost, yet by no means the only. This was a highly pluralistic city, very religiously diverse, and all manner of temples and idols and shrines could be found therein. May one even say that this particular city was one of the most religiously heavy cities in this corner of the Roman Empire in those days. Why do we point this out? Is it for mere rote academia? No. It is indeed by virtue of the fact that what we read here this morning occurred by no coincidence whatsoever in Caesarea Philippi, in a place that has a very long-standing, or had a very long-standing religious history, was drenched in religious idolatry, far more so than almost anywhere else we read about in the Gospels, including Jerusalem itself. And indeed, it speaks then to the power of what is said and what is proclaimed in the midst of all of that religious power and authority. So keep that in mind as we read through here as to that brief historical synopsis of the importance of Caesarea Philippi. Okay? So as we see there in verse 13, we're up in Caesarea Philippi, and then indeed Christ asks his disciples the following question: who do people say that the Son of Man is? You can see why that might be an important question by virtue of the fact that they almost certainly would have been standing in front of more than one temple or shrine or idol when that when that question was asked. Who do people say that the Son of Man actually is? And in verse 14 they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? He's asking them a very specific question. He's asking them for a declaration of who do you say that I am? Who am I to you? Again, the disciples have been around Christ for a while now. They've been hearing his teachings. They've been seeing the miraculous events occur. They've been seeing these signs and wonders that testified to the message that was being brought and to the revelation of the incarnate Son, to the Messiah himself. And he says to them, who do you say that I am? Who am I? Of course, those words, I am, ego eimi in the Greek, which we've explained many times before, that repetition in the Greek of the divine name is even inherent in the way that he's framing or asking that particular question. Who do you say I am? Right, as a play on words. And it is herein that we get these famous words from Peter. Because if you'll notice there in verse 16, Simon Peter, as he was still being referred to at this time, Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now this is the first complete, total, kind of plain and obvious proclamation on the part of anyone who's not a prophet of old that Jesus is indeed the Christ. That is why this text is so significant. That's why it's been treated as so significant, not just in the Gospels, but indeed throughout the New Testament, because it is the first time in this accounting of the life and the ministry of Christ that we get, for the first time, this plain, overt proclamation of Jesus as the Christos, right? As the Mashiach in Hebrew, as the Messiah, as the one who had been foretold and prophesied of for thousands of years prior. And here, Peter, not just simply acting in singular fashion, but acting essentially as a leader of the disciples, not formally but informally, proclaims both for himself and on their part, "You indeed, you are the Christ. You are the Mashiach. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." The Son of the living God being that reference which goes back to many Old Testament texts, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, of course, and so many throughout. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This first defining and seminal proclamation of Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah, the one that their ancestors and their forefathers had looked forward to for so long, the one which many, even in this day, were so hotly anticipating, based particularly on the prophecies that we get told in Daniel chapter 7. But indeed, you are the Christ. And so it's herein that we get what is a really important response on Jesus' part, that explains that this is not just merely words, nice words, good words, but rather words that contain within them great power. Power that is not of their own original source, but is in itself a proclamation of the power of God. Because if you keep reading, we see then in verse 17 that Jesus answered him and said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," right, meaning Simon the son of Jonah. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." We had to understand this quite plainly. This has been widely understood throughout the history of the church to be the reality that indeed the very knowledge of God comes by power of his Spirit, by the power of God's own revelation, not just generally throughout creation, which testifies to the reality of a creator, not just specifically through the scriptures, which, in that wording, specifically testifies and reveals God, and particularly Christ, to us in specific detail, but indeed then the understanding of the mind and of the heart of any individual comes not by intellectual prowess, not by academic diplomas and degrees that hang on walls, but rather fundamentally and foundationally by the Spirit of this very living God whom we have read of, who reveals himself to people, who makes himself known. You have not come to this by your own understanding, is what Peter is being told here. It is not your great intellectual prowess or your academic qualifications as a peasant fisherman that has led you to such an incredible understanding that indeed the man standing before you is the long-awaited and foretold Messiah. He says instead that my Father who is in heaven, he is the one who has revealed this to you. It is God himself who is, as we've explained throughout our series on the divine attributes, the self-revealing God, the God who makes himself known through various avenues, as we've said, general revelation of the creation, the specific or the special revelation of the scriptures. He is the self-revealing God, and the fact that Peter rightfully knew and identified that Jesus was indeed the Christ, standing in his very midst, the God-man. This was made known to him by the power and the working of the living God. Not by the will of man or the flesh, but by the will of God are these things made known, according to the wording of John's prologue, in the opening verses of John chapter 1. And so therefore Christ continues by saying in verse 18, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." There's a number of things here that we're going to break down. Some wording, which is very important because Jesus is using some wordplay here, but as well as the fact of what it means that he will build his church, which is of course the seminal focus this morning, as well as the reality that is inseparable from such a fact that indeed the gates of Hades, or hell your translation may have, shall not prevail against it, namely the church, and what on earth that actually means, how that's been understood, what it means. We see here that he says that you are Peter. Now that might seem like a very obvious kind of duh statement. Yes, Jesus, you have eyes. This is indeed Peter standing before you. But rather he is saying this for a particular reason or purpose. Peter, in its masculine form, Petros in the Greek, means, depending on how you want to translate it or what emphasis you would like to place on the Greek, rock or stone, thinking not of a gigantic mountain or boulder, but rather a stone or a rock that one could hold in one's hand. Okay? So rock or stone is an applicable translation of Petros, right? Which is where we get the name in English, Peter. That's what his name would be in Greek. That's what it is in the manuscripts from which this is written. You are Petros. You are Peter. And upon this Petra, upon this rock, I will build my church. Now, in fairness, this particular verse has been exegeted and interpreted in a variety of ways, with a variety of different emphases across the centuries and indeed the millennia, some of which are perfectly applicable, because there is more than one way of understanding this text. Some of them, however, are very much not the way of understanding this text. Of course, in the days of the Reformation and the culmination of the medieval period, by the time we get to the turn of the 16th century, the 1500s, we have a doctrine that is endemic and inherent to the Church of Rome at that time, that indeed Peter was the first pope of Rome, the first bishop of Rome, in what they claimed was, and still claim to this day, is an perfectly connected and uninterrupted line of apostolic succession from the current Christus Vicari, the Vicar of Christ, the current Bishop or Pope of Rome, Francis, going all the way back to the first century to Peter himself in Rome. And it's built almost exclusively upon this one singular text, that you are Peter, and upon this rock, with Rome identifying the rock being Peter, I will build my church. Everything else that flows forth from the concept and the doctrine of the papacy spills ultimately from this particular text. No matter how evidently wrong, no matter how demonstrably incorrect, no matter how theologically ludicrous, no matter how pragmatically insane, anything you can think of that is possibly connected to the papacy in any given way, shape or form stems ultimately back to the justification and interpretation from this particular verse. What's interesting to note is that Jesus uses the feminine form of Petra, rock. Feminine, not in the specific sense of female, but feminine, which is what's done in the Greek, as we've explained before, when something is being referred to generally, especially in the face of someone who's just been referred to as Petros, masculine, because that's his name. If this was to be squarely and solely understood in the way that the Church of Rome would claim, we should expect to see, and upon this rock being in the masculine form also. That is not the case. Indeed, then, what is the rock? Because fascinating on one level, it is actually, to a degree, Peter and the apostles. We are told many times in Ephesians chapter 2 and other such texts that Christ is the cornerstone of the church, and the apostles are the foundation thereof. That is very much true. The apostles and their teachings, which we have encapsulated here in the scriptures, as God-breathed, as theonistos, to use that word, from 2 Timothy chapter 3, they form the foundation of the church. And we're then told that we are all living stones that are then built up in the great house or temple of God. That's why we in our bodies, we in our personhood are referred to as the temple of the living God, by virtue of the fact that the Spirit of God dwells in us just as God dwelt in the Holy of Holies in the temple. So yes, the apostles are very much the foundation of the church. When we teach and we exegete just as we are this morning, we are proclaiming from the teachings of the apostles. Yet these teachings cannot, and indeed should not, be understood as somehow being in isolation from the teachings of Christ himself. Everything that the apostles have or had was from Christ, was from the scriptures. Keeping in mind, when we've exegeted that passage from 2 Timothy chapter 3 that says all scripture is God-breathed, and where Timothy is exhorted for having remained faithful to the scriptures and having been taught the scriptures by his mother and grandmother, the scriptures, when the Apostle Paul is writing that letter to Timothy, is the only scriptures that existed at that time, which was what? The Old Testament. What did they do when they went around and founded the church in Philippi and the church in Thessalonica and the church all over in Antioch? They were teaching Christ from the Old Testament, not the New, because it hadn't been written. They were teaching and having sermons every Lord's Day, more than every Lord's Day in fact, from the Old Testament about Jesus. That's why when we exegete and study the Old Testament, we are to do it through the frame of our placement here in the new covenant, with Christ having been revealed fully to us in the incarnation, which is then proclaimed and recorded for us in the New Testament. But nevertheless, circling back to this particular verse, the reality of what is the rock, whilst yes, being Peter and the apostles, it is not in their own standing or their own right. It is in fact based on their teaching. Paul and Peter themselves say as much. You may recall in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that very famous early creedal statement that we find, particularly from verses 3 onward, 3 to 5 particularly. Right? That which I inherited, or that which I was given, I passed on to you as of first importance. That Christ died and was buried according to the scriptures, and that he was raised upon the third day according to the scriptures, so on and so forth. This statement, which most church historians now are identifying as being at least within the first 3 years of the church, potentially even as early as 18 months to less than a year. Very early on. In fact, the earliest thing that we have in all of the scriptures. But notice, that which I was given, or that which I learnt, that which I inherited, you can translate different ways, I passed on to you. That according to the scriptures. 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 Do you see? The apostles, including Peter, who is very much identified as, in essence, a leader of the apostles, are not particular and of honour in their own individual isolated right. They are rightfully honoured by virtue of their placement on the part of Christ and of their teaching of the Scriptures and of Christ himself. Do we have any particular teaching or proclamation that we've read thus far? Perhaps on the part of Peter? The answer is yes. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This, ultimately, is the rock. Namely, that you are the Christ, you are the King, you are the Messiah, you are God, and indeed the Son of the living God. That is the, in essence, motto of Christ's church. Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the King, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is the foundation. The person of Christ, the incarnate second person of the divine Trinity. Hence why he's using this wordplay that you are Petros, masculine, and upon this rock, Petra, feminine, referring back to what Peter literally just said to him, upon this rock that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my church. It is upon that foundation. That is why, and God bless them, the evidence that Peter was ever the first Pope of Rome, or that there is an unbroken line of apostolic succession coming all the way down to the modern day, the evidence of that can be found right here, in this big pile of nothing. Because you have to reinvent history. You have to redefine history. You have to take a hatchet to history in order to try and derive legitimacy and conclusions that are clearly in error. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is the rock upon which Christ builds his church. And notice there too, as is almost always the case when we read not just the words of Jesus, but likewise the words of the apostles, notice the certainty in the rhetoric that's being employed here. Notice the lack of uncertainty, the lack of doubt, the lack of vagaries or nuance in this particular wording that we see here from Jesus when he says in verse 18, and I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. You can search the Gospels high and low. You will never find words coming out of Jesus' mouth like maybe, or perhaps, or hopefully, or if the weather's right, or if things manage to fall my way. You find definitive adverbs. You find concrete language. This is indeed the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is the God-man. This is the divine one in flesh, who is sovereign over all things, who before the foundation of the world foreknew and predestined all of you, according to what we read in Romans chapter 8 and elsewhere. He is the one true sovereign over all the earth. He is indeed the one identified as the Basileia ton Basilion, the King of Kings, and the Kyrie ton Kurion, the Lord of Lords. He is the one who has authority, and indeed all authority in heaven and on earth, which has been given to him. These were his final words before his departure and ascension to the right hand of God. He can declaim and proclaim definitively his will. And so he therefore says that this is the rock, the fundamental theological reality, that I am the Christ, Son of the living God. Upon that rock, not sand, upon that rock, that sure foundation, I will build my church. It's interesting, indeed, to read and to proclaim and exegete those words on a day like Reformation Day. Because the claim that so often comes to Protestants is very much the fact that our thing that we've got going here only began 500 years ago. For anyone who studies the history of the church, they will realise that that is very much not the case. For anyone who bothers to actually study not just the historical context in which the Reformation occurred, but indeed the stated reasons, foundations, bases, and causes of the Reformation, you will understand that indeed the word Reformation was by no mere coincidence how it came to be known. It was not referred to as the Revolution. It was not referred to as the Restoration. But indeed another word beginning with R, Reformation, to reform. Inherent in that word is the understanding that the church and the gospel had not been hopelessly lost, had been abandoned, had been deserted. No. It did not need to be restored. Likewise, it had not become so horrifically and painfully corrupt that we needed to revolt against it. No. The word reform speaks to the very heart of what occurred and what has been occurring for 500 years now. To reform God's church, to cleanse the dead chaff that had built up and encrusted itself in and around it across the days of, broadly speaking, the high and late medieval period. It was a reforming. It was a going back to the original manuscript evidence of the Greek and of the Hebrew, not just simply and solely relying upon the Latin and the translational history that had developed long after the original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. That was in fact what very much sparked the Reformation. It was first and foremost when Luther, as an academic, first got access to Erasmus's interlinear. Interlinear meaning you've got, in that particular case, the Latin on one side of the page and the Greek on the other side of the page. For us today, it's usually the Greek in the English or the Hebrew in the English. Okay? And when he read, going through the Pauline epistles, the term that would be called for us in English penance, coming from the Latin, so the penance of the Eucharist, the penance of confession, the penance of Hail Marys, the penance of Lord's Prayers, the penance of pilgrimage, the penance of praying to the dead, the penance of praying for the dead, the penance of undergoing various rites and rituals, all the infinite list of saints' days that you could barely go all but a couple of days without stumbling into a saint's day for St. Billy Bob's dead cat that did some miracle sometime before. All the penance. When he read, for the first time in his life, the Greek, where instead of penitentia, penance in Latin, which is an active doing all the rites and rituals, instead what Paul wrote, metanoiates, repentance, he realised this is not what I thought it was. He realised, knowingly or unknowingly, I've been lied to. This is not what that text originally said. It did not say do penance. It said repent. And this is what sparked this realisation in his mind. Notice that that is by definition not revolutionary. It is not restorative, as if everything had just been completely lost. It is instead going back to the original Greek and Hebrew. It's getting back to the roots, theologically, of the church and the actual teachings of the apostles. Not what centuries later theologians and bishops would then read back into the apostles and into tradition as having been the teachings of the apostles. This is why this is to be remembered. This is why, and not just in a singular event 500 years ago, but as a process over 500 years, it is something to be celebrated and remembered for the powerful movement of God that it indeed was, for the illumination of the minds, not just of brilliant intellects like the Reformers, but all the way down to the peasant farmer in the field, who by the tireless work of the translators, like Luther into German, or William Tyndale into English, and Wycliffe and so on and so forth, could now actually read the scriptures in their own language and see and understand God's own word. Not have to endure any longer what they had been subjected to by that point, which was one Bible in an entire parish, sitting right there, or in fact in its actual context right here where the altar would be, not the pulpit, literally under lock and key, and written in Latin, which you can't read anyway. That's what the scriptures had become in a significant percentage of Christendom in the late medieval period. But now, where there was formerly darkness, light began to come into Christendom once more. Hence the Latin statement, post tenebra lux, after darkness, light. Why do we point this out? Why on earth are things like Reformation Day or the other evangelical feast days which we as a Reformed Baptist church partake in? Christmas, Good Friday, Easter, Ascension, and of course Pentecost. Why are these things important? Why is something like Reformation Day important? Because it speaks to the actual fulfillment of Christ's own words herein. That upon this rock, right, that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my church. And, as he finishes there, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Do you believe that? Do you believe that for 2,000 years and counting now, Christ has indeed been building his church? Do you believe that? Just as importantly, do you even know the history of said church? There's no shortage of questions that I could throw out here just to put you on the spot and ask you all manner of things. Name the apostolic fathers. Name an additional 3 ante-Nicene fathers. When was the Nicene Creed written? When was the Constantinopolitan Creed written? Name the first 4 ecumenical councils, their dates, and what issues they were resolving. What was the Donatist controversy? Who was Cyprian? What is the difference between the city of God and the city of man in Augustine's city of God? That's about 1% of the questions I could ask you just from the first 500 years of the church. Now, I say that not to make you feel bad or anything. Some of you may be able to answer those things, which is good. But here's why I highlight this. I would submit in the humblest possible terms, yet accurate terms, that indeed in the modern day, for us particularly as moderns, in too large a percentage of the Western church, we have all but forgotten and ignored the history of God's own church. We do not care for it. We do not even bother to care for it. You could walk into many places today and ask them about the Reformation, and their response would be, the what? You could ask them about the church in the Middle Ages and the beautiful, rich history of God's church in the medieval period, and they could not tell you even one thing. You could ask them about the vital significance of the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and they could not tell you a thing about it. They could not tell you equally why the Council of Constantinople in 381, as the follow-up to that council, was just as, if not more important than the Council of Nicaea. They cannot tell you how we got this very book, which many of you, by God's grace, are holding in your very hands. They cannot tell you how we know that it is accurate. They cannot tell you how we even have it here 2,000 years later. They cannot tell you about the fact that for most of church history, people en masse have not been able to have a copy in their hands. Yet we stand here being the recipients of those who quite literally spilt their blood upon the earth and who were burnt to death so that you can have this in your language and can read it. Many people died over this, not just during the Reformation, but across history. There are people throughout the history of the church, especially early on, in what's called the ante-Nicene or before Nicaea period, right? So the first 300 years, where the only thing we know about them is their names, sometimes, because sometimes we don't even know their names, and we get a sentence or two about how they were demanded by the Roman governor and authorities to give up information as to where the manuscripts, right, the scriptures, were being hidden. They refused and were fed to lions. They refused and were beheaded. They refused, they were skinned to death. They refused, they were burnt in a boiling pot of oil. They refused, they were crucified. And that's all we know about them. They've gone down in history as having been faithful to God through the act of A, proclaiming that he is indeed the Christ, and B, preserving the scriptures. We will meet them one day. But when we lose sight and ignore and don't even really bother to study, and not just study in the academic sense, I mean study to know and appreciate the history of God's church, we lose, when we do that, we lose an integral component of our understanding of God as indeed the living God. Ironically, we take a very Enlightenment era perspective of treating God as if he were deistic, meaning that, yes, he created this, he set it in motion, and then kind of just sat back and kicked his feet up and let it all just play out. Not cognitively, I'm not saying people are sent to that. What I'm saying, though, is that they start to veer in that direction when they treat church history with either ignorance, or even worse yet in some cases, contempt. Because we look back 1,000 years ago to, say, medieval England, for example, and we look back and go, well, they didn't look like us, they didn't dress like us, they weren't having potluck and morning tea after the service, they didn't even sing Amazing Grace. Were they really Christians? Right? But we fail to appreciate and to understand the incredible, the rich, and indeed the glorious history of Christ's church. And it's not just for nice ethereal means too, by the way. It's actually vital and important for our theology. Because you see what church history, what the creeds, what the confessions do, what the great theologians and fathers of the church do, is they provide guardrails for us. They provide barriers that demonstrate to us how Christians, often far smarter than ourselves, have actually worked through a given theological issue in times past and have put in the rigorous theological work that is required to demonstrate and to articulate and to exegete, say, the divinity of Christ, which is what the crisis of the 4th century was about, which is what the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople in the 4th century were all about. And they show us where the lines of heresy are, where the lines of false teaching are. They provide guardrails. The creeds and confessions are born out of that adventure and are born out of that mission. We here at KBC, again by virtue of being Reformed Baptists, we have our own doctrinal statement, which is heavily developed upon and in full commensurate ascension to the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which itself is overwhelmingly commensurate to many of the other great creeds and confessions, like the Westminster Catechism, the Augsburg Confession, the Canons of Dort, and so on. But our understanding of these things is not just merely academic, and it should never be treated that way, you see. Instead, it should be treated in its rightful perspective, namely, an understanding and appreciation for how God has worked and operated in the world across millennia now, how he is indeed building his church, which he says, by the way, that the gates of Hades will not prevail against. Hades in the Greek, being the underworld, the realm of the dead. Okay, the equivalent of what in the Hebrew you would call Sheol. Okay, the abode or the realm of the dead, the underworld, where everyone who has died has gone. Of course, we get many parables where we see, particularly in a very short parable, this divided between this realm of darkness and also this paradise, Abraham's bosom, so on in the story of Lazarus. We get a very brief glimpse into Sheol or to Hades. So the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, Hades being the realm of the dead. Of course, itself being symbolic of death. What is being meant by that? Because more times than not, certainly the vast majority of exegesis that I have ever read or heard, almost gets it back to front. Often, the phrase or the statement, the gates of Hades not prevailing against the church, is taken either implicitly or explicitly to be the church being assailed against by the forces and powers of darkness, which certainly occurs, of course. And that we will withstand that Christ will protect us, that we will not be overcome by death and by everything else that's represented through death, sin, Satan, the demonic forces, so on and so forth, right? Unfortunately, that fails to actually understand, at least specifically speaking, the very wording of what's being said here. The gates of Hades, the gates, and I know this will seem like a very obvious statement, but gates are a defensive mechanism. Gates are indeed something which is used to keep out, which is used to defend against onslaught. The gates of Hades. Notice it is not the sword of Hades, it is not the cavalry of Hades, it's not the trebuchet of Hades, it's not the air bombers of Hades, it's not 1,000 different things which we could use there in terms of military weaponry. It's the gates. What does that mean, that the gates of Hades shall not prevail, or in other words be victorious? Are the gates somehow magically growing legs and attacking us? No. We are assailing the gates of Hades. We are. The gates of Hades, the defensive mechanism, the defensive weapon of darkness, hell, sin, death, etc., everything else encapsulated in that, it will not be victorious. We will successfully march upon the gates of death itself and conquer it by virtue of the gospel, by virtue of the fundamental statement that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. We're on the offensive in that statement. Do you understand? And do you see? We are. We are not to hide here in our four walls, protect our little red gate at the front there, and batten down the hatches. Cross our fingers and hope for the best. We are on the offensive in that statement. The gates of Hades, which we are besieging, which we are launching bombs at, which we are attacking with siege engines and trebuchets and so forth, which we are battering down with a ram, which we are marching upon with our infantry, which we are charging with our cavalry, with every other military motif you could put in there, it will not prevail. The gates of Hades, of death, of sin, of hell, the forces of darkness that we are attacking, that we are on the affront, that we are on the offensive against, it will not be victorious. We will. And we will by virtue of the fundamental reality that Christ has indeed and is, continuing form, is indeed building his church upon the foundation of the apostles and the cornerstone of Christ himself. When we lose sight of the history of God's church, when we ignore it, we are indeed ignoring not just all of our spiritual predecessors, our spiritual ancestors, but indeed we are ignoring the actions of Christ himself. We are pretending that the church arrived with the advent of the internet, which is usually how people treat almost everything these days. And we are allowing the great modern hubris to seep into our own midst. That everything that was before us doesn't matter. We're now brilliant because we all know how to operate iPhones. So therefore, everything here and now is the only thing that matters. And oh boy, how that pervades almost every area of the modern consciousness and zeitgeist, does it not? That the here and now matters. Not the past, certainly not the future. No, just the here and now. Living right in the moment, man. A people, I might also add, who are stripped of their history are also very easily conquered and enslaved. When people are disconnected from their past, when they are disconnected from tradition, when they are disconnected from their ancestors and from their forebears and from those who have come before them, who have passed on to them a heritage and a lineage and a legacy, when they are removed of that and instead given a brand new history that is completely butchered and rewritten, or that is ignored as if only now matters, they are very easily manipulated. This has occurred commensurately, I would argue, in the West. Partly through no fault of our own, by virtue of having moved to the New World, having actually begun new nations in new lands, but nevertheless, that spirit, that ethos, has unfortunately and tragically been maintained even in the civic mind, yet also now in the church, where the creeds and confessions are forgotten, where the historic teachings and theologians are forgotten, where Christ's work through his church across 2,000 years is forgotten. And what develops? Anything. What happens? Churches go off the rails because they're not anchored to anything. There's no guardrails anymore. They have no concept of how Christians have worshipped for centuries and millennia. They don't know. They go off the rails theologically because they have no mooring. There is no port to which they're tethered. Even in theological college and in the academic arena, I have heard the most incredible and astounding things proclaimed forth from people with masters in theology. Things that were declared outright heresy 1,500 years ago. No concept. Because of the modernist hubris that history, who cares? May I leave you with this. We need to recapture, in significant and meaningful degree, an understanding and an appreciation of the history of Christ's church in the world. Not merely for academic rigour, not merely for intellectual pride, but indeed in order that we might glorify fully, commensurately, totally, and accurately the very Christ of said church. And that we may fully understand and believe that when Christ said, "Upon the rock that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail." When we read those words, we can actually believe, assent, and confess them knowingly and accurately. This is why a knowledge of the glorious history of Christ's church is indeed vital to glorifying God rightly and accordingly. And it is upon that note that I leave you with Soli Deo Gloria, which indeed is the catch cry of not just the Reformation, but of course the history of God's church, that it is to the glory of God alone. Amen.